And if, again, the stories are to be believed, and I kind of hope this is true because it's metal, is the last thing out of his mouth is when they're at, confess or, plead, more weight is the last thing he says. And then after that, he's pressed so much that his tongue literally comes out of his mouth. And depending on who you read, it was either a city official or the sheriff who took his cane and pushed it back in, which I'm sure they did it kindly and gently with the bottom of his staff.
I mean, we tell the kids anyway, and tour guides and the like here say that it was the sheriff, the George Corwin, that reinserted his tongue. I'm gesturing as though people can see it, but they reinserted his tongue gently with the end of a 3-foot cane.
Right. And so Giles is literally pressed to death, which couldn't have been a fun way to go. But it just goes to show you that when you're dealing with an a-hole, sometimes they can back that up. So whatever he did in life, I don't feel like he deserved the death he got, but he's sort of become this mythical figure in Salem in that I went to restaurant websites where he's listed among the hauntings. I went to the city's website itself, and he's listed in at least 3 places. And I'm just like, Giles gets around now that he's dead.
He's kind of our mascot. Like we have some stuff for Corey. He is supposedly, like, it's not clear whether he actually spoke words of a curse toward the sheriff or if it's considered more of like a karma thing, but that he really directed his initial ire at the sheriff, this one man in particular, and that sort of branched out into other people in office, and then that eventually branched out into like everybody in Salem. Anytime anything bad has happened, we look at it as, well, it's probably Giles Corey. And there's a thing that I imagine that we'll come back to. I don't recall now whether you have the Great Salem Fire as part of this story.
I didn't.
Okay, so when we come back, because that's a couple hundred years later. So
yeah, but I do know the only thing I have about it is his ghost supposedly appeared before it.
Yeah, well, and what's interesting is that, so a lot of people come to Salem, and if you're looking for an actual historically accurate sense, you're also looking at an old maritime town and that sort of thing. And you're looking for old clapboard houses, and there's a sort of very specific New England style farmhouse look where they're really tall and really steeply pitched roofs because we need the snow to slide off the roof. And we have a lot of it, and it's miserable, and you don't so much want your roofs to collapse. So that's the shape of the buildings, and there's a lot of uniformity in the older parts of Salem, and also the buildings are like, there are houses that you literally have to sort of turn and scamper rather than just walk down between them because they're so close together.
Right.
It's really crowded in. But then there's a section of Salem that is not as old as the rest of the town. And I mean, we're talking like, when I say section, I mean like 2/3 of Salem is much newer, because in 1914, we had this huge fire and it burned all of these old clapboard farmhouses and structures down. And the thing that's interesting about that is that the fire started at the base of Gallows Hill, which happens to be where Martha Corey was hanged. And it rushed directly. It's about a half mile from there, straight along the waterfront to where Giles Corey was pressed to death, and then continued all the way down to Pickering Wharf. So there's something sort of not necessarily supernatural, but creepy anyway about it going from where his wife died to where he died, and then right out to sea.
Right. And also, this is where the story of him cursing Corwin comes from. Not only cursing him, but all the sheriffs. And according to that theory, and in fact, a sheriff in the 1970s who had retired because he had a blood disorder and a heart ailment and moved to Florida, he was interviewed and he said that up to that point, a lot of sheriffs had blood issues and heart problems, like out of nowhere, like normal. Oh my God. Hey, you're sheriff. Oh, wait, what's wrong with me? And the ones who didn't had legal troubles. And if you look, you can find, no, that's not entirely true. But boy, a lot of them did, like 60%, like ish. If I had to pick, because I'm not going to claim I sat and worked out what the percentage was, just what I saw, right? And his opinion was that I guess in 1991, they moved to a new jail. And he feels like the new jail and the new sheriff's office moving there saved every sheriff after that, because that was the last time a sheriff had left because of, blood issues or heart issues that weren't.
Well, and the thing that's missed there is that the reason we moved the jail from Salem to Middleton in the first place is because the conditions were abysmal. Like into the 1990s, prisoners were still, it's now a granite structure rather than wooden, but otherwise it was still pretty medieval in a lot of ways. And so prisoners were still using buckets rather than plumbing and were sleeping on the floor and were wildly overcrowded before it was cool, and just, we're hipster barbarism in our criminal justice here in Salem. And so of course the sheriffs are going to get sick because they're also in that environment. They're also in that building. They're also exposed to the same toxins and molds and whatever. Like they get to go home at night, but then they're back there the next day as well. So they're exposed at pretty high rates to all manner of who knows what.
Right. So then, yeah, that makes a certain amount of sense. That makes actually total sense. But I do like the idea of it being a curse, and just because.
We like our weird here. We do like our weird. We just want it to be historically accurate weird.
Well, yeah, and see, that brings us to the last part of this, and that's the hauntings. And here's the thing: most of the stuff on hauntings I got from one of your local groups of ghost hunters, because everything else felt sponsored. It's like if you look at, like, there's a restaurant there, and I don't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but if you read their thing, they were big and they're haunted by Giles Corey and this and that and the other, and I can't find any actual connection between them and what happened. Like the places that I feel are haunted and make sense to be haunted is Proctor's Ledge, which is also Gallows Hill, I believe. Which is the old jail, the old Salem jail, and like I forget what it's called now, but it was a Hawthorne Cemetery or something like. It begins with an 8. Let me look at my notes.
There's the old burying point, but that's not any. That's a tricky one because that's where the tourists go. But first of all. Well, we can. I have thoughts about that. Is that, first of all, we didn't bury the victims, the murder victims, which is what these women and men that were accused of witchcraft were. We didn't give them burials. So they're not in any of the Salem cemeteries. The old Burying Point Cemetery only gets a lot of traffic because, first of all, it's right downtown, so it's convenient for the tourists on Halloween. And second, because we didn't bury the witches, the accused witches, we didn't have anywhere to sort of pay respects later once we decided to do that, once we decided to give them their own memorial. And so literally on the other, so it's a stone wall about I'm gesturing like that helps, like 4 feet high. And on one side of the stone wall is the old Burying Point Cemetery. And on the other side, there's sort of like a cutout that's I'm not good with distances, so I don't know. So it's maybe 50 feet long by 25 feet wide approximately. And there's stone benches that have been set into the stone wall. And each of the benches has one of the victims' names carved in it. And it has a quote from one of the witches. I don't know the quote off the top of my head, and so I'm not going to butcher it, but across the base. And it's a nice enough memorial for what it is, but all it was ever meant to be is a memorial, because whenever that memorial was constructed, we didn't know where the accused witches were hanged. We knew what Gallows Hill was because that's where we executed everybody else, but we didn't know for certain that that's where we executed the accused witches as well. And we didn't know where the bodies ended up. We do now. So Proctor's Ledge is a very new, like since 2015. So that's a super relevant thing, I think, for people to stop and think about, is that 1692, we killed 23 people. 2015, this is still relevant that colleges are granting are receiving major grant money and funding to conduct studies. And that's when we discovered that they were indeed hanged on Gallows Hill with all the rest of the criminals, and the bodies were unceremoniously either left for the animals or they were buried in unmarked non-Christian graves under what is now a Walgreens.
Yes.
And this is the best, because I've had people ask me, why would they bury them under a Walgreens? And it's like, oh, honey, the Walgreens wasn't here at the time. Okay. And then I sometimes they'll be smart enough to sort of come back around too with like, no, I mean, why would they put a Walgreens on top of them? And it's like, well, first of all, literally anywhere you go in New England, you're probably stepping on someone. Like we don't have big cemeteries in Salem like you do in, I grew up in upstate New York where it was either cemetery or not cemetery. And that was really clear. And in Salem, you can accidentally wander into a cemetery and you don't know you're doing it, and you can walk right through and not notice. And there are individual family plots. There are individual, see what I did there? There are individual graves that are just in the middle of nothing. And
what you did there.
Yeah. And so it's random and it's scattered and it's just a different concept. And so it's not like Walgreens came in and said, okay, we're going to just take down these markers. And because this here on the corner of Boston and Proctor Streets, Proctor, right, being one of the victims, that's where we're going to put our business, and, we don't care about these victims. No, it was an empty lot, and Walgreens decided to build on it. And then in 2015, they used ground penetrating radar to confirm, yes, this is where the victims of the witch hysteria were, those who were buried and who were not taken off and buried quietly in their family plot. They remained here. And so Proctor's Ledge is the memorial to the victims that is there. It's a couple hundred feet up from Walgreens on Proctor Street. And it's not meant to be a burial marker. It's meant to be a place of memoriam and reflection. But people still absolutely believe that that's a grave. And I'm like, all right, well, I can only take down so many of your cute little touristy misconceptions at a time. Want to go to the Harry Potter store?
Yeah. So what I was actually talking about was the Howard Street Cemetery, because while he was not buried there, that is roughly the site where Giles Corey was pressed to death.
Yeah, that's exactly where he was pressed to death. So yeah, it's on one side of, if you stand, there's another stone. We do a lot of stone walls here in New England. And if you stand on the stone wall, on one side is the jail, which until about 6 or 8 months ago, approximately, was a lovely bar and grill and 80s arcade bar. That has moved downtown. So